Is the world speedier now than the past, or are we just more aware of issues because of the internet and the speed level is actually always been the same? Ignoring the obvious burden of COVID. I feel like the world is falling apart. Things like global warming, racial unrest, etc. The world just seems to have so many terrible things happening at the same time. Is it always this bad? Like in the 1900s too? My theory is that the world has always been this overwhelming, but now we have access to so much information that we just get so many news headlines thrown at us. I grew up in a small remote town, and was unaware of the world 100 miles from my front door. My dad was in the military for a while, and was pretty worldly. He used to say if people knew what went on in the world, they would never sleep at night. If the internet did anything, it made us aware of what the world is really like. It also desensitized us. People don't blink an eye when they hear ISIS attack Syrian city. Until you watch a documentary on the topic, you don't get a real feel for the event. And even then, the documentaries will only further desensitize us. I can go on Netflix now and within seconds find a documentary about a serial killer. If news came out tomorrow there has been serial killer caught near me, I wouldn't bat an eyelid. Then again, news also plays a part in this. If there's bad news every day, doesn't that just become news? Information overload. You can't care about everything you hear about. It's exhausting. Desensitization is a thing though. Christmas Day bombing happens. Barely a blip 'cause no one else died, but a bombing in Iraq kills 25. Same coverage. It's the monkey's fear too. My favorite thing about that article is that the recommendations given at the end do not spell out T, R, Y. History was a far speedier place than most people realize. Mostly because movies make it look so nice and fake. In reality, day-to-day life was dirtier and harder in almost every respect. Go back to pre-WW2. And most of the chemicals that run our day-to-day life just didn't exist yet. That's medicines, cleaning products, plastic products, treated fabrics, food additives, etc. Life was much more violent in general too. People forget that places like the US have seen a 50-year decline in rates of violent crime reports. And people today are way more likely to law enforcement involved. That means that violent crime has gone down even more than the graphs show. Politics has always been flipped. Don't forget that every generation has had its violent radicals and overbearing law enforcement and absurd laws to deal with. Be glad we don't have an organized anarchist party with a penchant for dynamite anymore. Or private strike breakers that can gun down unruly workers. People have been killing others for political disagreements for all of human history. The list goes on and on. But in pretty much every facet of life, things have improved on average. Just to add to this, our mental health care in some places is significantly better as well. If I was alive even in the late 60s, given my vast arsenal of mental illness and bad track record with therapy and meds, I would most definitely be in a speedy mental institution doing God knows what. Probably with no clue even as to what is going on around me. The world is far from perfect. But it's getting better in some ways. My stepdad's first wife had a bad case of bipolar 1. Which they called manic depression back then. In 1961 she committed suicide, leaving 2 toddlers behind. I don't even know if there were medications available and they didn't work. Or what happened. She did see a psychiatrist regularly and had been institutionalized at least once. A generation later my stepsister was also diagnosed with bipolar. And thanks to modern medicine she leads a happy and productive life. It's better now. We're more aware and less tolerant of issues, though your history lessons should have taught you about the bad parts of the past. Take health and safety for example. There's a saying that rules are written in blood. It's true. Every rule exists because people were maimed, poisoned, irradiated, killed or otherwise harmed. Sometimes it was lack of knowledge, i.e. asbestos, sometimes it was lack of diligence, thalidomide, but most often it was because it affects someone, bottom line, to put any more than the minimum effort into welfare. Radium girls. We've come a long way and we've still got a ridiculously long way to go. But we are going. Yep. The world is definitely better today. Life can still really suck for a lot of people. But in general, humans are improving in the way we treat each other. We're better at human rights and stopping crime and at giving more people a decent quality of life. The thing we really need to work on is the way we treat our environment. According to Kierkegaard, there are fewer wars than ever now. I take that as some small comfort. In the early 1900s we had much less indoor plumbing. For one thing. We also had things like the Spanish flu pandemic and WWI. 1800s we had civil wars. 1700s we had slavery almost completely replacing indentured servants. 1600s we had religious schisms leading to widespread warfare, with some witch hunts to further decimate population. 1500s we had the Black Death. 1400s we had some ill-conceived crusades still dragging themselves along. 1300s we discovered fireworks could be used in cannons and guns to kill people rather than delight them in the evenings with sparkly light shows. 1200s we had invasions, disease, starvation. You can find spite and trash and despair everywhere and everywhere you look. If that's your focus, refocus. We also had things like the Spanish flu pandemic. For anyone who says but COVID-19. Remember that we had a worse understanding of medicine and there were less options for entertainment at home. Could you imagine quarantining for even a month with only Libgen, Wikipedia, and the news to entertain you? Now imagine doing that with only the books you can buy on the average person's salary, an outdated encyclopedia, and newspapers. Much worse understanding of medicine. That's an understatement. Medicine has come so far. The iron lung ventilator was invented in 1928 and dear God is it inferior to what we have today. The first antibiotic, penicillin, also wasn't discovered until 1928. If the flu gave you pneumonia, we had no answer to the bacterial infection. 150 years ago. Something like COVID might not have been even identified out of the background of general high mortality. A few doctors and natural philosophers might have got a bit of kudos presenting their paper on was the unusually lethal flu epidemic of 1870, actually a completely novel disease. To the Royal Society. Relevant Kierkegaard in a nutshell. TLDR, but seriously. Watch it anyway. They're amazing. We are, as a world, very seriously, very mathematically in the most peaceful time in history by a long shot. That was the most oddly, simultaneously comforting and discomforting thing I've ever seen. What a range of emotions we have. And that's Kierkegaard. In a nutshell. If you don't get equal parts awe and existential dread watching those videos, you may not be watching them correctly. I watched basically all I could when I was very sick and stuck home for a few days. It gives you dread, sadness, but also excitement for the potential future. We're just more aware. Technology and social media puts all news in front of us in a non-stop stream of information, good or bad. It can easily become overwhelming. Technology also gives you access to more people's opinions about the news instead of just idle chatter about a big story at work or the dinner table. And it is important to mention that media has a big negativity bias. Because it boosts clicks. and it boosts clicks because people are naturally attracted to bad news over good news. We also remember bad things far better than we remember good things. It's evolutionary. We have made massive leaps forward. Of course. With every few steps forward, there is one back. But the brutality of day-to-day life even 100 years ago is astonishing. Even in something already terrible like warfare, we have a lot more restraint with laws that help reduce the amount of atrocities committed. Others areas like medicine have been almost entirely positive, saving millions of lives and massively improving quality of life. The Good Old Days They Were Terrible is one of my favorite books. It's full of pictures from the end of the 1800s to the early 1900s. In the US, pointing out some of the worst parts of living back then. Obviously, much depended on your gender, skin color, and social class. You mention racial unrest. But back in that golden age, the US was living through the worst time of lynchings. Usually but not always of people descended from enslaved people with African ancestors. Women had it particularly bad if they were rural. Child labor was common. There were few if any safety rules on the job. And food was routinely corrupted, with additives like water and chalk in milk, flour, etc., to make the seller more money. Some days I'm nostalgic for my grandma's or mom's childhood. But I know I'm wearing rose-colored glasses and their lives were very much the exception, not the rule for most.